Beyond the temples and tombs of ancient Egypt, past the hieroglyphs that celebrate gods and kings, lies a world deliberately hidden from view, a world where power was not only declared on battlefields or carved into monuments, but whispered in silk-draped chambers behind palace walls. Here, concubines were far more than companions. They were instruments of diplomacy, symbols of divine fertility, and pawns in a dangerous game of succession. Their bodies carried the weight of dynasties. Their presence shaped alliances and betrayals alike. This is not the Egypt of schoolbooks or museum plaques. It is the Egypt of ritualized desire, political intimacy, and sacred sexuality woven into the machinery of empire. In these hidden spaces, the balance of power could shift with a single night, and the fate of kingdoms was often written not in stone, but in flesh. To understand the role of concubines in ancient Egypt is to step behind the painted walls and into the heart of a world deliberately concealed from public view. Official inscriptions spoke of pharaohs as divine beings, chosen by the gods, embodiments of order and cosmic balance. But the reality of court life was more complicated and more human. Inside the palace's most restricted quarters, beyond the grand audience halls and sunlit colonnades, were secluded chambers known simply as per-kaner, the house of the harem. These were not merely places of pleasure. They were political institutions, laboratories of lineage, and arenas where bodies became tools of statecraft. Concubinage in Egypt was never simply about physical desire. It was bound up with ideas of fertility, divine favor, and dynastic stability. A pharaoh's legitimacy rested not only on his military victories or his building projects, but also on his ability to produce heirs, preferably male. But numerous children of royal blood strengthened alliances and secured succession lines. Concubines, often called Hemet Nesu, women of the king, were vital to this process. They came from diverse backgrounds. Some were daughters of powerful officials, offered as tokens of loyalty. Others were captives from foreign campaigns, brought back from Nubia, Syria, or Mitanni as symbols of Egypt's dominance. A few were chosen from priestly families, their bodies believed to carry sacred potential. The palace harem was a world with its own hierarchies and rituals. At its apex stood the great royal wife, the principal queen, who held both ceremonial and political authority. Beneath her were secondary wives and concubines, their status ranging from honored consorts to virtual servants. Yet even those with little rank could wield influence. A single son born to a lesser concubine could become a contender for the throne, shifting the balance of power within the royal household. This possibility made the harem not just a domestic space, but a volatile political arena, where rivalries simmered behind closed doors, and every pregnancy carried implications for the kingdom's future. Daily life inside these chambers was regimented and ritualized. Surviving papyri, such as the Turin judicial papyrus, hint at strict supervision. Eunuchs, female attendants, and palace guards ensured the king's concubines remained secluded and pure, their contact with the outside world tightly controlled. Hygiene and appearance were paramount. Bodies were washed in perfumed water, skin oiled with frankincense and myrrh, hair styled with intricate braids or elaborate wigs. Cosmetics were not mere adornment. They were symbols of readiness, signaling fertility and divine favor. Concubines were expected to embody idealized beauty, mirroring the goddess Hathor, patroness of love and sexuality. Ritual also played a central role. Ancient Egyptian belief held that sexual union, particularly that of the king, was not a private act, but a cosmic event. Just as the Nile's annual flood symbolized rebirth and renewal, so too did the pharaoh's sexual vitality ensure the land's fertility and the gods' favor. Temple hymns from the reign of Amenhotep III speak of the king as a living embodiment of Amun, whose virility sustained the world. Concubines, therefore, were not mere companions, they were participants in a sacred drama, their bodies instruments of divine continuity. Foreign women often occupied a special place within this system. Diplomatic marriages and concubine exchanges were tools of international relations. Letters from the Amarna archives, written around 1350 BCE, reveal that foreign rulers would offer their daughters sometimes dozens at a time to cement alliances with Egypt. "I send you my beloved daughter," wrote the king of Mitanni to Amenhotep III, "that she may serve the house of Pharaoh and bear sons worthy of his throne." Such exchanges were less about romance than about diplomacy and dynastic strategy. The presence of foreign concubines also symbolized Egypt's supremacy, transforming political submission into intimate submission. But concubinage was not without its dangers. The concentration of ambition, jealousy, and desire within the harem made it a breeding ground for intrigue. The most notorious example comes from the reign of Ramesses III, when a group of concubines led by a woman named Tiye conspired to assassinate the king and place her son Pentuer on the throne. The plot was uncovered, and the conspirators were executed, their names erased from official records. The harem conspiracy, as it is now known, exposed the dark underside of this closed world, a realm where women, often dismissed as passive figures, could become catalysts for revolution. Even in death, concubines remain part of the royal story. Tombs in the Valley of the Queens and burial sites at Amarna contain elaborate grave goods belonging to women identified as consorts or secondary wives. Their inscriptions speak not only of beauty and devotion, but of their role in sustaining the royal lineage. One stela from the New Kingdom refers to a concubine as "she who renewed the blood of the two lands," a phrase that encapsulates both her biological function and her political significance. To study the concubines of ancient Egypt is to confront the intersection of power, ritual, and the human body. These women were not footnotes in history, but essential components of a system that fused sexuality with sovereignty, biology with theology. Their stories, though often hidden behind the silence of stone walls, reveal a civilization that understood power not just in terms of armies and monuments, but in the intimate, often brutal politics of the royal bedchamber. Long before the great dynasties built their pyramids and temples, the foundation of Egypt's most secretive institution, the royal harem, was already taking shape. Its origins were not in luxury or decadence, but in necessity. In a civilization where the pharaoh was considered divine, the continuation of his bloodline was more than a personal matter. It was a cosmic duty. Without heirs, the balance of Ma'at, the sacred order that governed the universe, risked collapse. And so the palace gathered women from across Egypt and beyond, weaving them into a structure that would become one of the most powerful yet invisible forces in the state. The earliest records of royal concubines appear in the Old Kingdom, around 2600 BCE. Tomb inscriptions from Saqqara mention Hemet Nesu, women of the king, who lived within secluded compounds attached to royal residences. These were not common women. Many were the daughters of noble families, their presence a guarantee of their father's loyalty. Others were captives from foreign campaigns, their submission serving as a living symbol of Egypt's power. Each woman represented a thread in the vast political tapestry that bound the kingdom together. Their role was not to rule, but to sustain the ruler, to ensure his name and lineage endured for generations. As Egypt expanded its reach through conquest and trade, the harem evolved into a complex institution. By the Middle Kingdom, it was no longer just a collection of women, but a fully staffed, carefully managed enclave within the royal household. Eunuchs and female overseers maintained strict discipline. Scribes recorded births, lineages, and ritual events with the same precision used for tax records or temple donations. Physicians and midwives tended to the women's health, while priests oversaw purification rituals that prepared them for their sacred duties. Life inside the harem was governed by routine, surveillance, and ceremony, every detail designed to serve the needs of the throne. Selection for the harem could be both an honor and a sentence. Families of status often offered their daughters willingly, knowing that even a minor concubine's child might rise to prominence. Captives, by contrast, were stripped of names and identities, absorbed into a system that saw them not as individuals, but as vessels of dynastic continuity. Foreign women, in particular, were valuable political tools. Diplomatic correspondence preserved in the Amarna letters shows rulers of Mitanni, Babylon, and Hatti sending their daughters to the Egyptian court. "She will serve the king as is fitting," wrote Tushratta of Mitanni to Amenhotep III, "and through her may our houses be bound as one." Such exchanges blurred the line between alliance and subjugation, turning intimacy into a political contract. Despite its secrecy, the harem's influence on state affairs was immense. It was within these walls that rivalries were born, alliances forged, and future kings conceived. The birth of a male heir could elevate a concubine overnight, granting her privileges and wealth unimaginable outside the palace. Yet the same event could spark envy and intrigue, as other women and their powerful families maneuvered to protect their own positions. The stakes were high, and the consequences of failure severe. Some concubines who fell from favor vanished from the record entirely, erased as if they had never existed. The harem's power also extended beyond the palace gates. Many concubines, particularly those of noble birth, continued to influence their family's fortunes. A father whose daughter bore a royal child might see his estates expanded, his sons appointed to prestigious priesthoods, or his lineage secured within the ruling elite. Through these invisible networks, the harem became an engine of patronage and loyalty, a system that tied the kingdom's most powerful factions directly to the throne. Yet for all its influence, the harem remained deliberately hidden from public life. Ordinary Egyptians knew little of what occurred behind its high walls, though they understood its significance. Temple reliefs and funerary texts speak of the pharaoh's role in ensuring cosmic order, but they remain silent on the intimate realities that made that role possible. The harem's invisibility was part of its power. By concealing the machinery of succession, the monarchy maintained an aura of divine inevitability. The pharaoh did not merely reproduce. He created heirs as part of a sacred cycle, with the harem serving as the unseen engine of that continuity. By the time of the New Kingdom, the institution had become indispensable. Under rulers like Thutmose III and Amenhotep III, harems grew in size and sophistication, housing hundreds of women and their attendants. Some lived in luxurious compounds with gardens, baths, and private chapels. Others resided in stark seclusion, their movements restricted, their identities subsumed by the demands of royal destiny. Together, they formed a vast human infrastructure, one that sustained Egypt's divine kingship not through conquest or law, but through the intimate, regulated power of reproduction. The birth of the royal harem was not a tale of romance or indulgence. It was a calculated system, shaped by theology, politics, and necessity. It transformed women into instruments of statecraft, and made the hidden world of the bedchamber as crucial to Egypt's survival as its armies or temples. Beneath the grandeur of the pharaoh's reign lay this silent institution, unseen but indispensable, binding the future of a civilization to the bodies and lives of those who live behind its guarded doors. Entry into the royal harem was neither spontaneous nor unstructured. It followed a methodical process shaped by centuries of tradition, politics, and religious belief. Women did not simply arrive at the palace and become concubines. They were chosen, examined, trained, and transformed into figures that symbolized fertility, loyalty, and divine favor. This was not merely the assembling of a king's household, it was the crafting of a living institution, one body at a time. The selection process often began in childhood. Families of noble rank, eager to bind themselves to the throne, would present their daughters at court, offering them as potential companions for the pharaoh. Girls from priestly lineages were especially valued. Their association with temples and ritual purity made them ideal candidates for a role so deeply tied to divine continuity. Captives taken from foreign campaigns were another source. They were often paraded before the court and screened not only for beauty but for health, temperament, and lineage. In many cases, foreign women represented entire treaties, their bodies, a pledge of peace or alliance. Ancient texts hint at the criteria used to determine suitability. Surviving fragments of harem records from the New Kingdom mention grace of form, brightness of eyes, and purity of spirit as prized qualities. Physical perfection was not only a matter of aesthetic preference, but of symbolic significance. A concubine's beauty reflected the cosmic order the king was meant to uphold. Flaws, whether in body or character, were thought to invite disorder. Examinations were thorough and often invasive, conducted by palace physicians, priestesses, and attendants. A woman chosen for the harem was expected to embody the divine feminine, both in appearance and demeanor. Once selected, the preparation began a transformation that could last months or even years. Girls were removed from their families and relocated to the palace, where their former identities were gradually stripped away. They learned new names, often symbolic ones tied to gods, stars, or virtues. Instruction in etiquette was rigorous. They were taught how to walk with measured grace, how to bow and speak in the presence of royalty, how to manage silence and expression. Their gestures, posture, and even laughter were disciplined into forms that reflected reverence and submission. Education extended beyond courtly manners. Concubines were trained in music, poetry, and conversation skills that made them not just companions, but intellectual partners. Some learned ritual dance, designed to mirror celestial movements and please the gods. Others studied the religious symbolism of scents, cosmetics, and garments, understanding how each detail carried meaning in the elaborate ceremonies of palace life. The preparation was as much psychological as it was physical. It was designed to reshape the mind, to instill in each woman the knowledge that her body and presence were now part of the machinery of divine kingship. Physical preparation was equally intensive. Daily cleansing rituals were performed with sacred oils and fragrant waters. Skin was exfoliated with natron and anointed with myrrh and frankincense. Hair was styled into elaborate coils or covered with wigs woven from imported Nubian strands. Kohl was applied to the eyes not merely as decoration, but as a sacred protection believed to ward off illness and evil spirits. Even clothing was symbolic. Fine linen, bleached until nearly translucent, was draped with precision, its folds meant to evoke purity and grace. Ritual purity was essential. Before entering the pharaoh's presence, a concubine underwent ceremonial bathing and fumigation with incense. Priests recited invocations to Hathor and Isis, invoking fertility and blessing. These rites were not performed for the king's pleasure, but for the balance of the cosmos. The union between pharaoh and concubine was framed as a reenactment of divine myths, a reflection of the gods' creative acts that sustained the world. In this view, the concubine was more than a woman. She was a vessel through which cosmic order was renewed. Foreign women, though often entering the harem through political arrangements, were subjected to the same process of assimilation. Many were given Egyptian names, taught the language, and initiated into local customs. Some embraced the transformation as a path to power and security. Others, torn from their homelands, lived in a state of enforced silence. Archaeological evidence from palace sites shows imported jewelry and textiles among harem artifacts, subtle reminders of the cultural fusion that occurred within these secluded walls. The selection and preparation of concubines also served a deeper political function. It reinforced the image of the pharaoh as the center of the world, drawing women from across regions and classes into his orbit. Each concubine represented a connection to a noble house, a conquered land, a divine lineage. Their collective presence was a physical manifestation of Egypt's reach and influence. Through them, the empire's diversity was gathered, contained, and symbolically united under the authority of the king. By the time a woman was deemed ready to serve, she was no longer simply herself. She was a carefully crafted embodiment of ideals: beauty, obedience, fertility, and divine purpose. Her personal story, her name, her origins were often erased, replaced by a new identity shaped entirely by the needs of the throne. Behind the grandeur of temples and monuments, this silent transformation was taking place, year after year, generation after generation. The making of a concubine was as deliberate and intricate as the carving of a statue or the writing of a sacred text, and every detail served a single purpose: to sustain the pharaoh's power and the eternal order of the world he ruled. The royal harem was not an abstract idea. It was a physical place carefully designed, heavily guarded, and deliberately hidden from the eyes of the public. Archaeological traces, palace records, and rare references in temple inscriptions allow us to reconstruct what these spaces were like: worlds within worlds, where silence, ritual, and politics intertwined. They were built to protect to control, and above all, to conceal the machinery of royal reproduction, a machinery as essential to Egypt's survival as its armies or irrigation systems. The harem complex was typically located within or adjacent to the main royal palace, yet always separated by layers of walls, courtyards, and checkpoints. Access was strictly controlled. High walls blocked the view from outside, while narrow guarded corridors allowed only authorized personnel to enter. Even high-ranking officials were often forbidden beyond the outermost gates. Only eunuchs, female attendants, physicians, and select priests were permitted inside. These restrictions were not merely about privacy, they were about security. Within those walls lived potential mothers of future pharaohs, and with them, the future of the state itself. The internal layout reflected a precise hierarchy. At the center stood the apartments of the great royal wife, the queen, whose quarters were often richly decorated with painted walls, carved columns, and garden courtyards. Radiating outward were the residences of secondary wives and concubines, arranged according to rank and favor. Those closest to the king's attention lived nearest to his own chambers, while others occupied more distant quarters. Servants, guards, and attendants lived in adjacent wings, forming a human barrier around the harem's most important inhabitants. The harem was more than a living space. It was a self-contained city. Kitchens prepared meals with ingredients chosen for their symbolic and nutritional value: honey, dates, figs, and spices, believed to promote fertility and vitality. Bathhouses were equipped with alabaster basins and clay pipes for warm water, ensuring the women's bodies were always maintained in a state of ritual purity. Storerooms overflowed with fine linens, cosmetics, jewelry, and oils imported from across the empire, each item a testament to the wealth and reach of the pharaoh's power. Education and entertainment were also integral parts of harem life. Some rooms were dedicated to music and dance, where concubines were trained to perform rituals or offer private entertainment to the king. Scribes taught reading and writing to those considered promising, while priestesses led lessons on religious rites and temple myths. The harem was not simply a place of waiting, it was a site of preparation, where women were shaped into instruments of dynastic and cosmic purpose. Yet beneath the luxury, the harem was also a prison. The women who lived there were rarely permitted to leave, and when they did, it was under heavy escort. Letters found in the Amarna archive include complaints from foreign princesses about isolation and neglect, suggesting that life inside could be stifling and lonely. Their movements, communications, and interactions were closely monitored. The walls that protected them from external threats also kept them firmly under control. Surveillance extended beyond physical confinement. The harem had its own internal administration, staffed by overseers and scribes who recorded every birth, illness, and ceremony. Lists of gifts, inventories of clothing, and logs of ritual activity were meticulously maintained. One surviving document from the reign of Ramesses II mentions the delivery of 12 jars of perfumed oil and 7 bolts of linen to the chambers of the women. A small but revealing glimpse into the bureaucratic precision that governed life within. The very intimacy of the harem was catalogued and accounted for, a reminder that even the most private aspects of royal life were matters of state. Religious symbolism permeated the architecture itself. Gardens, where they existed, were often designed to mirror the fields of the afterlife described in the Book of the Dead, filled with lotus ponds and sycamore trees. These landscapes were not only decorative, but deeply symbolic, linking the fertility of the women within to the cosmic renewal of the land. Some harems even contained small shrines dedicated to Hathor or Isis, where offerings were made before important ceremonies or births. In these spaces, the line between the sacred and the intimate dissolved. Every chamber, every pool, every threshold was part of a larger cosmic order. The security around the harem reflected its political weight. It was not uncommon for plots and conspiracies to emerge from within. The infamous harem conspiracy against Ramesses III, for example, unfolded entirely within these walls, orchestrated by a concubine and high-ranking officials determined to place her son on the throne. After the plot was discovered, the participants were tried and executed, their names stricken from records. This episode revealed a truth that kings never forgot. The harem, while essential to dynastic continuity, was also a potential source of its undoing. For those who lived within, the harem was a paradox, both sanctuary and cage, a place of privilege and power, but also one of restriction and erasure. To outsiders, it was an enigma, glimpsed only in rumor and official decrees. To the state, it was indispensable, a living apparatus that transformed women into instruments of succession and sanctified the king's divine role. And though centuries have passed, the faint outlines of those chambers, their corridors, their gardens, their silent halls, still speak of a world where power was measured not only in temples and armies, but in the guarded breath of women waiting behind locked doors. Life within the harem was governed not only by politics and hierarchy, but by ritual precise, symbolic, and deeply rooted in the Egyptian worldview. Every action, from bathing to dressing, carried sacred meaning. These rituals were not mere formalities. They were believed to maintain cosmic balance and align the bodies of the king's women with divine order. The concubine's role was not simply to please the pharaoh, it was to embody the principles of fertility, purity, and renewal upon which the universe itself depended. Cleanliness in ancient Egypt was both a physical and spiritual necessity. The women of the harem underwent daily purification rituals overseen by priestesses and attendants trained in temple practice. At dawn, they bathed in water drawn from sacred pools or the Nile itself, believed to carry the blessings of the gods. Natron, a naturally occurring mineral used in temple cleansing, was rubbed over the skin to purify and exfoliate, removing not just dirt, but spiritual impurities. Perfumed oils of myrrh and lotus followed, sealing the body in divine fragrance and symbolizing rebirth. This process was not optional. It was considered essential preparation for any encounter with the king, who embodied the living gods Horus and Ra. Cosmetics were another layer of ritual transformation. Kohl was carefully applied to the eyes, not only for beauty, but for protection against evil spirits and disease. Malachite and galena powders were ground into pigments associated with the goddess Hathor, whose attributes of love, fertility, and motherhood the concubines were expected to reflect. Lips and cheeks were tinted with ochre, symbolizing vitality and life force. Even jewelry had sacred function. Amulets depicting ankhs, scarabs, or the Eye of Horus were worn close to the skin, believed to guard fertility and ensure divine favor in conception. Clothing, too, was steeped in symbolism. Fine linen garments were bleached until nearly white, the color of ritual purity. Draped in careful folds, they evoked the goddess Isis, whose maternal power and protective nature were invoked before any royal encounter. The act of dressing was accompanied by prayers and invocations, whispered by attendants as they wrapped, pinned, and perfumed the fabric. In these moments, the concubine was transformed from an individual into an instrument of cosmic order, her body no longer her own, but part of a larger sacred design. Fertility rites were among the most significant rituals performed within the harem. Before a concubine was permitted to share the pharaoh's chamber, offerings were made at shrines dedicated to Hathor or Min, the god of virility. These ceremonies often involved burning incense, pouring libations, and presenting symbolic foods such as dates, figs, and honey, each representing abundance and renewal. In some cases, priestesses would anoint the concubine's abdomen with sacred oils, a gesture meant to invite the god's blessing upon future conception. The idea was not simply to produce heirs, but to harmonize the act of reproduction with the natural cycles of the cosmos. Astrology and divine timing also played a role. Egyptian priests tracked celestial movements with extraordinary precision, and royal unions were sometimes scheduled to coincide with auspicious alignments of stars or the appearance of certain deities in the night sky. Such timing was believed to increase the likelihood of conception and ensure that the resulting child would be favored by the gods. These beliefs were not mere superstition. They were woven into the fabric of Egyptian kingship, which presented the pharaoh as a mediator between heaven and earth. The concubine's participation in these rituals was therefore not passive. It was a vital contribution to the divine machinery of the state. The preparation extended beyond physical rituals to psychological conditioning. Concubines were often required to spend periods in seclusion before being summoned to the king's presence. During this time, they fasted from certain foods, abstained from speech, and engaged in meditation or recitation of hymns. These practices were believed to quiet the mind, align the spirit with the divine, and ensure that the woman approached the pharaoh with proper reverence. The silence of these secluded days reflected the stillness of creation. Before the world emerged a metaphor that cast the concubine's role as part of a larger cosmic act. Even the king participated in aspects of these preparations. Before entering the harem, he too underwent purification rituals and anointing ceremonies, reaffirming his divine identity and readiness to enact his cosmic duty. The union of king and concubine was thus presented not as a private moment, but as a sacred event, echoing the mythological unions of gods and goddesses that sustained creation. In this context, the harem was not merely a household, it was a temple, and its rituals were extensions of the state religion itself. The meticulousness of these practices reveals much about Egyptian thought. The body was not a vessel of desire, but a conduit of divine power. Fertility was not a private matter, but a national concern. And intimacy, when linked to kingship, was elevated to a sacred act, one that sustained the land, the people, and the cosmic balance. Behind the palace walls, in chambers few ever saw, rituals unfolded daily that blurred the line between the physical and the divine. To the outside world, they were invisible. To Egypt, they were indispensable. The harem was far more than a place of beauty and ritual. It was a political arena, one of the most dangerous and consequential in the entire Egyptian state. Every glance, every whispered word, every pregnancy had the potential to shift the balance of power. The royal bedchamber was a space where dynasties were secured, alliances forged, and rivalries sharpened into weapons. It was here, behind closed doors, that the future of Egypt was often decided long before it was ever declared in public. Succession was the most obvious stake. The pharaoh's legitimacy depended on producing heirs, and the birth of a royal child, especially a son, could elevate a concubine from obscurity to influence almost overnight. A woman who had once been invisible could, with a single birth, become one of the most powerful figures in the kingdom. She would gain wealth, attendance, influence at court, and, most importantly, a voice in state affairs. Her family, too, might benefit, receiving land grants, priestly appointments, or seats in the royal bureaucracy. This elevation made the competition among concubines intense, and the politics within the harem as ruthless as any battlefield. The queen, or great royal wife, stood at the top of this hierarchy. She held ceremonial precedence and wielded influence as the official consort. But even her position was not untouchable. A concubine who bore a son while the queen remained childless posed a subtle but potent threat. Such scenarios often led to factional divides within the palace. Nobles, priests, and generals would quietly align themselves with different women, betting their futures on the potential rise of one heir over another. These rivalries could simmer for decades, only to explode upon the pharaoh's death when succession was contested. The story of Ta, a lesser wife of Amenhotep III, illustrates how swiftly the balance could shift. Initially, a concubine of non-royal birth, she became one of the most powerful queens in Egyptian history after giving birth to a son, the future Akhenaten. Ta wielded immense influence in court politics, foreign diplomacy, and religious affairs, reshaping the political landscape from behind the palace walls. Her rise demonstrates how the royal bedchamber could serve as a launchpad for political transformation, elevating women from obscurity to central figures in state governance. Such influence was not always welcomed. Many queens and royal mothers saw ambitious concubines as existential threats. Intrigue, espionage, and sabotage were common. Servants might be bribed to report private conversations. Priests might issue oracles that undermined a rival's favor with the gods. In extreme cases, poisonings and disappearances hinted at darker measures. The most infamous example of this volatile environment was the harem conspiracy during the reign of Ramesses III. Ta, another woman of lower rank, plotted with palace officials to assassinate the king and install her son, Pentuer, as pharaoh. The plot failed, but the scale of the conspiracy revealed the political potential that concubines held. They were not passive figures, they were actors in a deadly drama of succession and power. Foreign women added another layer of complexity. Many concubines entered the harem as part of diplomatic marriages, bringing with them the interests of their native lands. Their children could become symbols of alliance or potential threats. A son born to a Mitanni princess, for instance, might have claims to both thrones, making him a valuable asset or a dangerous rival. Foreign wives sometimes acted as informal ambassadors, maintaining communication between Egypt and their homelands, shaping foreign policy in ways that historians are only beginning to understand. The royal bedchamber, in this sense, was also a stage for international relations. The stakes were not limited to the succession itself. Influence over the pharaoh through affection, persuasion, or manipulation could affect decisions ranging from temple construction to foreign wars. Chronicles from the reign of Thutmose III suggest that certain court policies shifted dramatically following the rise of favored women within the harem. One inscription records a significant temple endowment to a goddess associated with fertility shortly after a royal birth, likely reflecting the influence of the child's mother on religious policy. Decisions that appeared purely administrative or religious on the surface were often shaped by the intimate dynamics of the harem beneath them. But this political power came with danger. A concubine who overreached could find herself exiled, executed, or erased from the historical record. Names were deliberately chiseled from monuments, and papyri were destroyed to obliterate the memory of those who had fallen from favor. The silence surrounding many of these women in the archaeological record is not an accident. It is the result of a deliberate effort to rewrite history, to conceal the extent of their influence, and to present kingship as a solitary, divine institution, rather than one shaped by competing human ambitions. The royal bedchamber was, in truth, one of the most volatile arenas in the ancient world. It was where dynasties began and where they sometimes ended. It was a place where love, ambition, and fear converged, where the boundaries between private desire and public power dissolved completely. To stand at the center of that world was to live with immense potential and constant peril, a reality that every woman behind the palace walls understood all too well. And though their names are often lost to time, their actions shaped the destinies of pharaohs, kingdoms, and the civilization that still captures the world's imagination thousands of years later. The royal harem was not merely an Egyptian institution, it was a diplomatic stage, an instrument of empire, and a mirror of the world beyond the Nile. As Egypt expanded its influence across the ancient Near East and into Nubia, the women within the harem became living embodiments of conquest, alliance, and negotiation. Foreign concubines were not simply spoils of war or tokens of peace. They were strategic assets whose presence could stabilize borders, secure treaties, and even shift the balance of power between rival states. From the early New Kingdom onward, foreign women formed a significant portion of the pharaoh's household. They arrived in Egypt through two main routes: as captives seized during military campaigns, or as diplomatic gifts sent by foreign kings seeking favor. Both paths reflected the political realities of the time. Conquest brought with it not only territory and tribute, but also people including noblewomen and princesses whose forced integration into the harem symbolized Egypt's dominance. Diplomacy, on the other hand, required gestures of trust, and few gestures carried as much weight as sending one's own daughter into the household of another monarch. The Amarna letters, a cache of 14th century BCE diplomatic correspondence, offer a rare glimpse into how this system operated. One letter from Tushratta, king of Mitanni, to Amenhotep III, speaks plainly of the political significance of such arrangements. I send to my brother the king my beloved daughter, that she may dwell in his house and strengthen the bond between our nations. Another letter reveals frustration when a promised marriage alliance was delayed, highlighting how critical these exchanges were to maintaining peace. Through these unions, treaties were sealed not just with ink, but with bloodlines. The status of foreign concubines varied widely. Some were treated with respect and granted privileges approaching those of native-born wives. They retained servants from their homeland, maintained correspondence with their families, and participated in court ceremonies. Others, particularly those taken as captives, occupied lower ranks within the harem, their identities stripped away as they were absorbed into Egyptian society. Regardless of their rank, however, their presence served a political purpose. Each foreign woman represented a bridge or a chain linking Egypt to the territories it ruled or sought to influence. These women also carried with them their cultures, beliefs, and languages, subtly shaping life within the harem. Artifacts from palace sites include foreign jewelry, cosmetics, and even religious amulets, suggesting that cultural exchange flowed in both directions. In some cases, foreign deities were incorporated into the religious practices of the harem, their worship blending with Egyptian rituals. A Mitannian princess might invoke Ishtar before entering the pharaoh's chambers, just as an Egyptian concubine prayed to Hathor, a quiet fusion of traditions that reflected Egypt's status as a cosmopolitan empire. The children born of these unions presented both opportunity and risk. On one hand, they could serve as symbols of unity between Egypt and its allies. On the other, they posed potential threats to the purity of the royal bloodline, at least in the eyes of certain factions at court. Debates over legitimacy often swirled around the sons of foreign concubines. Some were granted prestigious positions in the priesthood or military, while others were quietly sidelined to prevent disputes over succession. The line between asset and liability was thin, and the political fate of a foreign-born prince could change with the shifting winds of power. Occasionally, foreign women leveraged their positions to influence state policy directly. Letters from Babylonian and Hittite courts reveal that queens and concubines often acted as intermediaries, relaying requests, negotiating dowries, and even arranging marriages for their children. A well-placed word in the pharaoh's ear could lead to trade agreements, military alliances, or the construction of temples in distant territories. In this way, the harem functioned as an informal diplomatic corps, one whose influence extended far beyond the palace walls. Yet the presence of foreign concubines also bred suspicion and resentment. Egyptian elites sometimes viewed them as outsiders whose loyalties lay elsewhere. Their children could be seen as potential usurpers, their ambitions fueled by foreign courts eager to see their blood on the throne. Tensions within the harem often mirrored those in the wider political landscape, with factions forming around different maternal lineages and foreign alliances. The resulting intrigues could destabilize the court and even threaten the stability of the state itself. One telling example comes from the late 18th dynasty, when tensions flared between factions aligned with foreign-born women and those representing native noble families. Letters from this period hint at behind-the-scenes struggles over succession, temple patronage, and access to the king. These conflicts underscore a central truth. Foreign concubines were never passive participants. They were active players in the geopolitical chessboard of empire, their bodies and children carrying the weight of treaties, rivalries, and ambitions. The integration of foreign women into the royal harem reflects the broader character of Egypt's imperial power, a blend of force and diplomacy, dominance and assimilation. Through them, Egypt extended its reach into foreign courts and wove distant lands into its political fabric. Yet their presence also reminded the pharaoh and his advisors that power was never absolute. Every alliance came with obligations, every child with potential complications, every embrace with political consequences. Within the walls of the harem, the empire's borders were redrawn not with armies, but with marriages, and the fate of nations often rested on the lives of women who, though confined to the palace, shaped the course of history far beyond it. Life inside the royal harem was a paradox of privilege and captivity, a careful balance of opulence and control that shaped every moment of the women's existence. From dawn to dusk, each day followed a rhythm designed to maintain order, reinforce hierarchy, and preserve the sacred image of the king's household. Though outsiders imagined the harem as a place of luxury and leisure, the reality was far more complex. It was a place where discipline ruled, rituals shaped routine, and every action, no matter how mundane, served a larger political and religious purpose. The day often began before sunrise with purification. Attendants, many of them eunuchs or older women of trusted status, entered the chambers quietly, bringing vessels of water infused with lotus petals or natron salts. Each concubine underwent a ritual cleansing meant to purge both physical and spiritual impurities. Hair was combed and oiled, skin was rubbed with fragrant resins, and nails were polished smooth. Cleanliness was more than vanity. It was a sacred duty, a sign of readiness to serve the pharaoh, whose presence was considered divine. Even when no royal summons came, the ritual had to be performed. A concubine's body was not her own, but part of the sacred machinery of kingship. Meals were elaborate, yet regulated. Breakfast might include figs, dates, and honeyed bread, foods associated with fertility and vitality. Wine was reserved for evenings or ceremonial occasions, while beer, considered a staple, was served daily. Foreign delicacies, pomegranates from Syria, incense-scented oils from Punt, spices from Nubia appeared on the tables of high-ranking women, a subtle reminder of Egypt's reach and wealth. Eating was often communal, but seating arrangements strictly reflected rank. The great royal wife dined separately, or at the head of the group, followed by secondary wives, concubines, and attendants. Even a minor shift in seating could signal changing favor or influence. Education filled much of the day. Younger concubines were instructed in the arts of conversation, poetry, and music, skills meant to delight and engage the king. Others studied temple hymns and mythic texts, learning the sacred stories that justified their place within the royal household. Dance instructors taught ritual movements modeled after celestial cycles, graceful, measured gestures, meant to echo the rhythms of the cosmos. These performances were not private amusements, but ceremonial acts, often staged during festivals or temple rites, to reaffirm the pharaoh's divine role. Craftwork and domestic arts also played a role in harem life. Women of lower rank wove linen for palace use, embroidered garments, or prepared scented oils. Some were assigned to oversee the care of sacred animals, or assist priestesses in temple offerings. Others managed storerooms and inventories, keeping meticulous records of jewelry, cosmetics, and ceremonial items. This labor was not servitude in the traditional sense. It was part of the harem's function as a self-contained institution, sustaining itself as both a household and a political organ. Contact with the outside world was rare and tightly controlled. Messages were delivered by palace scribes and read under supervision. Visits from family members were limited, and when they occurred, they were monitored closely. For foreign concubines, letters from their homelands were often censored or delayed, and in some cases, never delivered at all. This isolation was intentional. It ensured that the women remained dependent on the palace, and that their loyalties could not be divided. Yet it also bred loneliness and despair. Archaeological evidence, such as small personal amulets, handmade figurines, and graffiti carved into the plaster of private chambers, suggests that many concubines clung to small rituals of remembrance, preserving fragments of their past lives in secret. Despite the rigid order, the harem was also a social world. Friendships and rivalries flourished within its walls, shaping alliances that could determine a woman's fortune. Gossip spread quickly, and a single rumor, whether about a pregnancy, a falling out with a servant, or a perceived slight from the queen, could ripple through the community with lasting consequences. Some women found comfort in these relationships, forming bonds that lasted their entire lives. Others used them as tools, forging alliances to secure influence or undermine rivals. These subtle dynamics often mattered as much as the rituals or lessons of the day. Evenings were the most unpredictable part of harem life. Sometimes they passed uneventfully, with women gathering in shaded courtyards to sing hymns or play music beneath the stars. At other times, a royal summons might arrive without warning. Preparation for such an event was swift and intense baths, perfuming, elaborate hairstyles, and the careful selection of linen and jewelry designed to please the king's eye. A summons could change a woman's future overnight. It might lead to increased status, gifts, or even the possibility of bearing a royal child. But it could also end abruptly, with the king's attention shifting elsewhere, leaving the woman to return to her chambers and wait once more. Life behind the veil was thus a constant negotiation between isolation and influence, devotion and ambition, ritual and reality. It demanded patience, discipline, and an unspoken acceptance of the fact that one's fate rested largely in the hands of forces beyond control, the whims of the pharaoh, the intrigues of rivals, the blessings of the gods. To the outside world, The harem was a mystery, a hidden corner of royal life, shrouded in silence. To those who lived within it was an all-encompassing world, one where time was measured not by days or seasons, but by the rhythms of favor, ritual, and hope. No transformation within the harem carried greater weight than the passage from concubine to mother. Bearing a royal child, and especially a son, changed everything. It altered not only a woman's place within the palace, but also the political landscape of Egypt itself. In a world where kingship was both divine and hereditary, motherhood was power. And those who achieved it found themselves elevated from obscurity to influence, from silence to authority, shaping decisions that would ripple far beyond the walls that once confined them. The title MWT, Nesu, Mother of the King, was one of the most revered in Egyptian society. It conferred status that surpassed that of most queens, and guaranteed privileges that even high officials could not dream of. The mother of a future pharaoh gained her own household, estates, attendants, and ceremonial honors. She was addressed with divine epithets, sometimes associated with Isis herself, the archetypal royal mother whose nurturing of Horus symbolized the restoration of order after chaos. Statues and temple reliefs often depicted these women cradling their sons, not as mere mothers, but as protectors of Ma'at, the cosmic balance that sustained the universe. But the journey to such power was perilous. Pregnancy within the harem was a matter of intense scrutiny and secrecy. As soon as a concubine showed signs of conception, she was relocated to a secluded part of the palace under constant supervision. Midwives and physicians monitored her health, while priests performed rituals meant to safeguard both mother and unborn child. Offerings to Hathor, Isis, and Tauret, the hippopotamus goddess of childbirth, were made regularly, invoking protection against miscarriage, disease, or evil spirits. Every precaution reflected the immense stakes. The future of the dynasty might rest on the life growing within her. Birth itself was both a private ordeal and a state event. While the actual delivery took place in seclusion, news of a male child's arrival was announced with fanfare, drums, processions, and offerings to the gods. Priests recorded the exact hour and celestial conditions of the birth, details believed to shape the child's destiny. If the newborn was deemed healthy and legitimate, the mother's status transformed overnight. She would now sit beside the queen in public ceremonies, receive gifts and estates, and wield influence over appointments and policy. Even if she never saw the throne herself, her son's ascent would ensure her enduring presence at its center. The stories of some of Egypt's most powerful women began this way. Tia, originally a concubine of non-royal birth, rose to extraordinary prominence after giving birth to Amenhotep IV, better known as Akhenaten. She became the king's closest advisor, her opinions shaping religious reforms that shook the foundations of Egyptian society. Mutemwiya, another secondary wife, became the mother of Amenhotep III, one of the most celebrated pharaohs of the New Kingdom. Her elevated status allowed her family to ascend socially and politically, forging alliances that would influence the court for generations. Motherhood also brought risk. A woman who bore a son became both a revered figure and a potential threat to others. Rival concubines and even the queen herself might conspire to diminish her influence or undermine her child's claim. Infants sometimes died under suspicious circumstances. Accusations of sorcery or poisoning were not uncommon. In this treacherous environment, a royal mother's survival depended on her ability to navigate palace intrigue, forge strategic alliances, and maintain the king's favor even after her usefulness as a consort had waned. The relationship between mother and son was itself a political tool. Pharaohs often emphasized their maternal lineage in official inscriptions, especially if their mother came from a prestigious background. This association strengthened their legitimacy and linked them symbolically to divine matriarchs like Isis or Hathor. Mothers participated in public ceremonies, presided over temple rituals, and occasionally acted as regents if their sons ascended the throne while still children. In these cases, their authority could rival that of the most powerful male officials in the kingdom. Even death did not diminish their significance. Many royal mothers were buried in richly furnished tombs, their funerary texts celebrating their role in sustaining the dynasty. Some were deified posthumously, worshipped alongside their sons in temples or honored in household shrines. Their names, carved into stone and repeated in prayers, endured for centuries, a rare immortality in a world where most concubines vanished from the historical record without a trace. Yet the vast majority of women who bore children in the harem never achieved such fame. Many sons were passed over for succession, their mothers quietly sidelined. Others died young, erasing the political capital their birth had promised. These women faded back into the shadows, their brief moment of influence extinguished by the relentless realities of dynastic politics. But even they contributed to the web of alliances, loyalties, and rivalries that defined the court, their children serving as priests, generals, or governors in the vast machinery of the state. The transformation from concubine to mother was the most profound shift a woman could experience within the harem. It was both a triumph and a gamble, an ascent that could lead to extraordinary influence or devastating downfall. And in a society where the fate of a civilization rested on the strength of its kings, the women who bore them were far more than figures of domesticity. They were architects of dynasties, guardians of continuity, and in their own way, wielders of a power that rivaled the crown itself. Behind the thick limestone walls of Egypt's royal harems, where silence and ritual shaped daily life, another reality thrived, one fueled by ambition, jealousy, and political maneuvering. Beneath the polished veneer of devotion and obedience, the harem was a pressure chamber where alliances were forged and betrayals planned. With the birth of every royal child, the stakes climbed higher. For many women, survival and the future of their sons depended not only on favor, but on cunning. And sometimes, that struggle erupted into open rebellion. Competition began long before a woman ever saw the king. Status within the harem determined everything: the quality of one's quarters, the attentiveness of attendants, the access to education, and most importantly, the likelihood of being summoned. The great royal wife held ceremonial dominance, but her power was constantly tested by ambitious concubines, particularly those who had borne sons. The hierarchy was fragile, and the slightest change of pregnancy, a whispered promise, a favor granted could topple it overnight. It was this volatility that turned the harem into one of the most politically charged environments in the ancient world. Gossip was its first weapon. Information flowed in hushed tones through corridors and courtyards: who had been summoned, who had fallen from favor, who might be pregnant. These whispers could elevate or destroy reputations, influence the king's perceptions, and shape the alliances forming among officials outside the harem. Servants were often bribed to carry messages or plant rumors, and even minor attendants could become pawns in elaborate games of deception. What might appear to be idle chatter was often the first move in a carefully orchestrated campaign of influence. Bribery and manipulation followed. Wealthy families sent gifts to secure better positions for their daughters, while rival factions courted palace officials, hoping to sway decisions about succession or ritual honors. Some women offered treasures or estates to temple priests in exchange for favorable oracles, divine messages that could shape public opinion or legitimize their children's claims. The boundaries between religion, politics, and personal ambition blurred completely inside the harem, where divine favor could be as much a political tool as a spiritual truth. Yet intrigue sometimes escalated beyond whispers and manipulation into plots of deadly consequence. The most infamous of these is preserved in the judicial papyrus of Turin, which records the so-called harem conspiracy during the reign of Ramesses III in the 12th century BCE. At its center was a concubine named Ta, not the queen, but the mother of a son, Pentower, who had been passed over for succession. Determined to see her child crowned, Ta conspired with palace officials, guards, and even scribes to assassinate the pharaoh and place Pentower on the throne. The plan was elaborate. Messages were smuggled in wax tablets. Conspirators swore oaths before gods, and an army of insiders prepared to strike during one of the king's public ceremonies. But the plot unraveled before it could succeed. The conspirators were captured, tried, and executed, some forced to take their own lives, others mutilated before death. Pentawere himself was compelled to die by suicide, his body hastily buried without ceremony. The papyrus, preserved in chilling detail, exposes not only the scale of the conspiracy, but the atmosphere of suspicion and ambition that fueled it. This was not an isolated incident. Scholars believe lesser plots likely occurred throughout Egypt's history, though they were suppressed or erased from official records. The presence of foreign concubines added another layer of tension, as alliances with outside powers raised fears of external interference. Factions within the harem sometimes aligned themselves with military leaders, priestly orders, or rival branches of the royal family, creating networks of influence that extended far beyond the palace walls. In this way, the harem was not a sealed-off sanctuary, but a node in Egypt's wider political web, one capable of destabilizing even the most powerful kingship. Even when conspiracies did not culminate in bloodshed, their threat shaped the behavior of kings and courtiers alike. Security around the harem was intensified. Guards were vetted and rotated regularly to prevent loyalties from forming. Messages were censored, visits restricted, and even the queen's activities monitored. The palace became a theater of mutual suspicion, where trust was scarce and betrayal always a possibility. Pharaohs learned to rule not just with armies and temples, but with spies, interrogators, and informants placed within the most intimate corners of their own households. For the women themselves, these rivalries were both a risk and a necessity. To do nothing was to be forgotten. To act was to risk everything. Some navigated this treacherous environment through careful alliances, attaching themselves to influential officials or priestly factions. Others relied on subtlety gifts, flattery, divine omens to advance their position without attracting dangerous attention. A few gambled on boldness, conspiring to rewrite the line of succession itself. Most failed, and history swallowed their names. But their struggles reveal a truth often obscured by the image of passive concubines. These women were active participants in the politics of the court, shaping outcomes in ways that official inscriptions would never acknowledge. The harem's conspiracies exposed the fragile nature of Egyptian kingship, a system that projected divine permanence yet was constantly vulnerable to human ambition. Behind the symbols of eternal order, chaos brewed quietly, nurtured by jealousy, desperation, and the relentless pursuit of power. And in that hidden battleground, where alliances were as deadly as daggers, the fate of kings and the course of dynasties often balanced on the decisions of women the world was never meant to see. In ancient Egypt, sexuality was never viewed as a private indulgence or a shameful necessity. It was a sacred force, a reflection of cosmic creation, divine will, and the eternal cycle of life and death. Within the royal harem, this belief shaped every aspect of intimacy. The relationship between pharaoh and concubine was not understood merely as a human act, but as a ritual reenactment of myths that explained the very existence of the universe. In this worldview, the bedchamber was not a place of pleasure alone, it was a temple, and the body itself was a vessel through which divine order was renewed. Egyptian religion taught that the world began through a creative act, an act often described in sexual or generative terms. The god Atum brought forth creation through self-generation, a metaphor that linked sexual energy with cosmic power. Isis and Osiris, the archetypal divine couple, embodied the principles of love, union, and resurrection, while their son Horus symbolized the continuity of kingship. These myths were not abstract stories to the Egyptians. They were living templates that shaped rituals, ceremonies, and the structure of political authority. The pharaoh's role was to mirror the gods, ensuring that cosmic order Ma'at triumphed over chaos, Isfet. His union with the women of the harem was one way this balance was ritually enacted. Concubines, therefore, were not merely chosen for their beauty or lineage, they were selected for their role in this sacred narrative. Before entering the pharaoh's presence, they underwent purification rites and invocations that framed them as embodiments of divine femininity. Hymns dedicated to Hathor, goddess of love and fertility, were recited as priestesses anointed their bodies with perfumed oils. Incense burned to honor Isis, and offerings were placed before statues of Tauret and Bes deities, believed to protect intimacy and childbirth. These rituals transformed the concubine's identity from a royal servant into a sacred participant in the ongoing renewal of the cosmos. Even the physical setting of the royal chamber reflected this religious framing. Walls were often decorated with scenes of lotus flowers and papyrus reeds, symbols of rebirth and creation. Fragrances associated with deities filled the air, and small shrines were sometimes present within the private quarters, where prayers were offered before union. The act itself was seen as a continuation of temple rituals. Just as priests reenacted the creation of the cosmos in daily ceremonies, so too did the pharaoh, through union, reaffirm the divine vitality that sustained his rule. Timing was crucial. Astronomers and priests consulted the stars to determine the most auspicious moments for conception. Certain festivals, such as the Feast of Min, dedicated to the god of fertility, were particularly favored for royal unions, as they symbolically linked the king's virility to the fertility of the land. During these times, rituals often extended beyond the palace, with public ceremonies celebrating the pharaoh's generative power. The people believed that just as the king's seed would bring forth heirs, so too would the Nile's floodwaters bring life to the fields. The health of the state, the land, and the cosmos were all thought to flow from the same source. The connection between sexuality and the divine extended beyond reproduction. It was also about regeneration and immortality. Myths of Osiris emphasized the life-restoring power of Isis's devotion, a model for how love and union could transcend death itself. In temple rituals, priests symbolically reenacted the goddess's act of reassembling Osiris's body, an image that found reflection in the pharaoh's own conjugal life. Intimacy was thus both a physical necessity and a metaphysical act, one that bound the king to the cycles of life, death, and rebirth that governed the universe. Concubines were deeply aware of their role in this cosmic order. Many bore titles linking them to the divine, such as Beloved of Hathor or Adorner of the Lord of the Two Lands. Inscriptions from the New Kingdom referred to royal women as she who renews the blood of the two lands, a phrase that underscores their symbolic function in sustaining the kingdom's vitality. Even their pregnancies were framed as sacred events, accompanied by temple offerings and prayers to ensure that the unborn child carried divine favor. The birth of a son was not just a political triumph, but a religious one, evidence that the gods continued to bless the pharaoh's line. Religious ideology also justified the hierarchy within the harem. Just as the gods themselves had complex relationships with primary consorts, secondary wives, and divine concubines, so too did the king. The queen often represented Isis or Hathor in her elevated role, while concubines could embody lesser deities, celestial spirits, or aspects of the divine feminine. This structure gave theological weight to what might otherwise appear as mere politics. It also reinforced the idea that each woman's participation was essential to the cosmic whole, regardless of her rank. Even in death, the sacred framing persisted. Some concubines were buried with amulets invoking fertility and renewal, their tomb inscriptions referring to their service as part of the divine order. Others were depicted in temple reliefs not as lovers, but as priestesses, their roles intertwined with rituals that sustained the realm. This blending of religion and intimacy ensured that their presence remained part of Egypt's sacred landscape long after their names were forgotten. To modern eyes, the royal harem might seem a hidden corner of private life. To the ancient Egyptians, it was anything but. It was a vital extension of temple and throne, a place where gods and mortals met, where creation was reenacted in flesh and blood, and where the most intimate of human acts was elevated into a ritual that kept the universe itself in balance. Within the complex social order of the royal harem, language itself was a tool of authority. Titles, epithets, and symbolic names did more than identify individuals. They defined status, communicated proximity to power, and encoded the hierarchy that governed life behind the palace walls. In a world where a single word carved into stone could legitimize a dynasty or erase a lineage, the titles of concubines and royal women carried immense weight. They transformed ordinary names into instruments of statecraft, embedding women's roles in the language of divinity, politics, and cosmic order. The most prestigious title, Hemet Nesu Weret, Great Royal Wife, was reserved for the principal queen, whose position was both political and ceremonial. She was the official consort, the mother of heirs, and the visible embodiment of Isis or Hathor, the divine feminine who legitimized the king's rule. Yet the titles of concubines, though less exalted, were no less revealing. Many bore the designation Hemet Nesu, wife of the king, or Kemet Nesut, beloved of the king, each carrying subtle distinctions in rank and function. These names appeared on tomb inscriptions, temple walls, and even administrative records, quietly documenting the complex web of relationships that sustained the monarchy. Some titles reflected specific roles within the harem's inner workings. Smet Neset, companion of the king, often denoted a favored concubine who shared the pharaoh's private chambers frequently. Irit Per, lady of the house, was sometimes granted to women responsible for overseeing the harem's domestic functions, managing attendance, or supervising ritual preparations. Others were known as Nefert Nehe, beautiful one forever, titles that spoke to ideals of eternal youth and divine beauty, qualities that were believed to mirror the unchanging order of the cosmos itself. Foreign-born concubines sometimes received Egyptianized names and titles upon their entry into the harem, symbolizing their assimilation into the sacred order of the state. A Mitannian princess might be renamed with a theophoric title, one invoking a god's name signaling her new identity as part of the pharaoh's divine household. This practice was more than cultural convenience. It was a ritual act that erased foreign identity and rewrote it in the language of Egyptian power. It transformed a diplomatic bride from an outsider into a vessel of Maat, ensuring that even alliances sealed by marriage were framed as divinely ordained. Titles were not static. They evolved over time, rising or falling with a woman's fortunes. A concubine who bore a royal son might receive new honors Mwt Nesu, mother of the king, or Kenemet Neferu, united with beauty, marking her ascent in status. These designations carried political consequences. They could grant access to estates, priesthood privileges, or influence over temple appointments. They also shaped how future generations remembered her. Inscriptions on tomb walls and stelae often highlighted these titles as the defining features of a woman's life, emphasizing the roles that bound her to the divine and royal order. Symbolism extended beyond titles to the objects, colors, and iconography associated with the women of the harem. Jewelry, for instance, was more than ornamentation. Gold necklaces shaped like lotus blossoms symbolized rebirth and regeneration, while amulets bearing the ankh, the symbol of life, affirmed a woman's role in sustaining the royal lineage. Scarabs, linked to the sun god Khepri and the daily renewal of life, were worn as protective charms, believed to ensure fertility and divine favor. Even the fabrics they wore were infused with meaning. White linen symbolized purity, while blue pigments drawn from lapis lazuli represented cosmic order and celestial protection. Ceremonial objects within the harem also reflected this symbolic language. Mirrors were crafted in the shape of the goddess Hathor's face, invoking beauty and love. Perfume jars bore inscriptions dedicating their contents to Bastet or Isis, linking sensuality to divine blessing. Thrones, stools, and cosmetic boxes were often carved with hieroglyphic prayers or images of protective deities, embedding sacred power into the most intimate aspects of daily life. These objects were not mere possessions. They were ritual instruments that reinforced a woman's place in the cosmic and political hierarchy. The inscriptions and titles bestowed on concubines were also a means of control. To grant or revoke a title was to elevate or erase a life. A concubine who fell from favor might find her name chiseled from monuments, her epithets scratched away, her memory condemned to oblivion. This practice, known as damnatio memoriae, served as a political weapon, a warning to others of the consequences of disloyalty or ambition. Conversely, those who maintained favor saw their names and titles preserved in temples, tombs, and administrative records, ensuring their legacy long after their physical presence had vanished. The language of titles and symbols thus functioned as both reward and restraint, as recognition and regulation. It bound the women of the harem to the ideological foundations of kingship, transforming their personal identities into public roles that supported the state's authority. Their names became prayers, their adornments became talismans, and their positions became part of the living mythology of the pharaoh's reign. Even in death, this language endured. Funerary inscriptions often emphasized titles over personal names, highlighting a woman's service to the king and the divine order. Beloved of the living Horus, one tomb inscription reads, "She who renewed the blood of the two lands." Such phrases reveal how deeply intertwined identity and duty were within the harem. These women were not remembered as individuals, but as manifestations of ideals, embodiments of beauty, fertility, loyalty, and cosmic harmony. In a society where words shaped reality, the titles and symbols of the royal harem were more than markers of status. They were instruments of power, tools of memory, and the language through which the unseen forces of kingship were made visible. Through them, the concubines of ancient Egypt, many of whose real names are lost to time, continued to speak across millennia, their roles inscribed into the very fabric of Egypt's eternal story. At the heart of the royal household stood a paradox, one woman crowned in gold as the great royal wife, and dozens, sometimes hundreds, of others living in her shadow. The relationship between queen and concubines was not one of simple dominance and submission. It was a complex, shifting balance of cooperation, rivalry, ritual obligation, and silent hostility. In a palace where lineage was destiny and fertility was power, even the slightest imbalance between these women could reshape the political landscape of the kingdom. The queen's position was both exalted and precarious. As Hemet Nesu Were, she embodied the divine feminine often associated with Hathor, Isis, or Mut, and stood beside the pharaoh in religious ceremonies, diplomatic audiences, and public festivals. Her presence validated the king's authority, symbolizing the union of male and female forces that sustained Ma'at, the cosmic order. But the queen's ceremonial supremacy did not always translate into absolute control over the royal household. The very system that elevated her also placed her in constant competition with women who, though technically subordinate, could alter her destiny with a single birth. A queen's primary duty was to provide a male heir. If she succeeded early in her marriage, her position was usually secure. But if she failed, her authority could erode rapidly. Concubines who bore sons often became powerful figures in their own right, and their children might be elevated to positions of prominence, sometimes even bypassing the queen's offspring if political circumstances favored them. This dynamic made the harem a landscape of quiet tension. Each pregnancy was more than a domestic event. It was a potential shift in succession, a challenge to established hierarchies, and a test of loyalty among the court's most powerful factions. Some queens sought to neutralize these threats by embracing their rivals as allies. They took active roles in managing the harem, forging alliances with favored concubines, and guiding their children's futures. A skilled queen could weave the ambitions of others into a network that ultimately strengthened her own power. Queen Nefertari, wife of Ramesses II, is believed to have maintained cordial relations with several of the king's secondary wives, securing their loyalty and integrating their children into her political orbit. This strategy ensured that even potential rivals acted in ways that reinforced her influence. Others adopted a more defensive approach. Queens were known to exile rival concubines to remote estates, confine them to lesser quarters, or quietly undermine their favor with the king. Allegations of witchcraft, treason, or impurity, whether true or fabricated, could lead to a woman's downfall. A subtle shift in court gossip, a single unfavorable omen pronounced by a temple oracle, might be enough to sever a rival's ascent. These tactics were risky but sometimes necessary in a system where a queen's failure to act could lead to her displacement or worse, to the elevation of another woman in her place. The relationship between queen and concubines was further complicated by public perception. While the existence of harems was accepted, the queen's image as the pharaoh's divine partner could not be publicly undermined. Official inscriptions and temple reliefs almost never acknowledged the presence of concubines, presenting the royal marriage as singular and sacred. Behind closed doors, however, reality was far more pluralistic. Concubines wielded soft power, influencing decisions through conversation, persuasion, or maternal authority. The queen, for all her official status, often had to negotiate with this informal sphere of influence, balancing ritual supremacy with political pragmatism. Foreign queens added another layer of complexity. Marriages to foreign princesses often carried enormous diplomatic weight, elevating their status and potentially eclipsing that of native-born concubines, and even the primary queen herself. Some of these royal brides retained strong ties to their homelands, serving as conduits for information and influence. Their presence could shift alliances, alter foreign policy, and reshape the dynamics within the harem. Native queens sometimes viewed these foreign wives as dangerous rivals, while concubines might resent the special treatment and privileges they received. In some cases, concubines and queens found themselves unlikely allies. When external threats loomed, whether from rival claimants, priestly factions, or foreign powers, they shared a common interest in protecting the legitimacy of the royal family. Joint efforts to support a particular heir or suppress dissent demonstrate that the relationships within the harem were not purely antagonistic. They were fluid, shaped by circumstance and necessity, as much as by competition. Yet, even in moments of cooperation, the fundamental imbalance remained. The queen's power was public, ceremonial, and tied to divine order. The concubine's power was private, subtle, and rooted in personal influence. Both forms were essential, and both could undo the other. A queen without the loyalty of the harem could find her authority hollow. A concubine without the queen's acknowledgement could see her ambitions crushed before they took shape. This delicate balance defined the atmosphere of the palace. It was a world of careful words and measured gestures, where smiles might conceal resentment and courtesy might mask calculation. Every woman understood her position could change overnight, elevated by the birth of a son, destroyed by a whisper, transformed by a royal decree. The harem was a court within a court, and its politics were no less sophisticated or ruthless than those of the broader kingdom. In this silent struggle between crown and chamber, between divine wife and mortal rivals, the stability of dynasties was often forged. It was not just battles, temples, or decrees that shaped the fate of Egypt, but the hidden negotiations between women, negotiations conducted in private chambers, but felt across empires. The queen and the concubines did more than share a king. Together, they shaped the political, religious, and familial foundations of the state itself. The royal harem did not simply shape the present of the Egyptian court, it cast long shadows over its future. Every child born behind its guarded walls represented both continuity and chaos, a potential heir or a dangerous rival. In a monarchy where blood determined legitimacy and legitimacy justified divine rule, the presence of numerous sons, many born to concubines of varying rank and origin, was both a strength and a curse. Egypt's dynasties were built on this delicate balance, and they were sometimes torn apart by it. In theory, succession was straightforward. The throne was to pass to the eldest legitimate son of the great royal wife, a lineage that reinforced the symbolic pairing of king and queen as divine counterparts. In practice, the reality was far messier. Concubines often bore children before the queen did, or their sons proved more capable, more charismatic, or more politically connected than the official heir. Foreign alliances, priestly endorsements, and military loyalties all played roles in shaping who would ultimately wear the crown. The result was a political landscape rife with uncertainty, and one where illegitimate sons were far from powerless. Some of Egypt's most transformative rulers were born of secondary wives. Thutmose III, often called the Napoleon of Egypt for his military campaigns and state building, was the son of a concubine named Iset, not the principal queen. His path to the throne was anything but smooth. Initially sidelined in favor of his stepmother Hatshepsut's regency, he eventually seized power and became one of the most formidable pharaohs of the new kingdom. His reign demonstrated that a concubine's son, dismissed as a lesser heir, could become a conqueror whose name would echo for millennia. But such stories of triumph were often preceded by years of turmoil. Succession disputes between legitimate and illegitimate sons frequently erupted into political crises, and sometimes civil war. Court factions formed around rival claimants, each backed by powerful allies. Priesthoods might favor one candidate, while the army supported another. In this volatile environment, the harem's alliances became crucial. Concubines maneuvered to secure appointments, wealth, or temple patronage for their sons, building the networks necessary to support a claim. A royal childhood was not spent merely at play, but in preparation for a struggle that could determine the fate of a dynasty. Illegitimacy itself was a flexible concept in Egyptian thought. While lineage from the great royal wife carried the highest prestige, children born to secondary wives could still be considered legitimate if acknowledged by the king. Such acknowledgement might come in the form of a public proclamation, a temple dedication, or the granting of a ceremonial title. Once recognized, these sons could be elevated to positions of authority as generals, priests, or provincial governors, giving them platforms from which to pursue greater power. Yet this flexibility also sowed confusion. Competing claims of legitimacy blurred the lines of succession, allowing disputes to fester long after a king's death. The most dramatic example of these tensions unfolded during the late 20th dynasty, after the assassination of Ramesses III. The harem conspiracy spearheaded by the concubine Tia on behalf of her son Pentawere was born of frustration with succession protocols that excluded secondary sons from power. Though the plot failed, it revealed the depth of resentment among those excluded from the line of inheritance. Pentaware's forced suicide was not just the punishment of a traitor, it was the silencing of a claim that threatened to upend the established order. Even when disputes did not escalate to violence, they often left scars on the historical record. Kings erased the names of rival claimants from monuments and official lists, attempting to rewrite history as if their reigns had been uncontested. Others sought to retroactively elevate their mother's status, commissioning statues and inscriptions that described them as beloved wives or divine consorts. These acts of propaganda were attempts to solidify fragile legitimacy, to present as inevitable what was often the result of bitter internal struggle. Illegitimate sons who failed to claim the throne were not always eliminated. Many were assigned high-ranking positions that kept them both honored and contained roles that satisfied their ambitions without threatening the reigning pharaoh. This practice served two purposes. It prevented rebellion by offering status, and it allowed the crown to benefit from the talents of men whose royal blood still carried weight in the eyes of the elite. Yet even in these cases, suspicion lingered. A successful general with royal lineage might one day decide to march on the capital, and a priest with blood ties to the throne could rally religious support against a sitting king. The stakes extended beyond individual ambition. Succession disputes could weaken the state, drain resources, and invite foreign interference. Allies and vassals, uncertain about who would rule, might withhold tribute or switch allegiances. Border provinces could exploit moments of instability to assert independence. Even the Nile cycle, so often interpreted as signs of divine favor, could take on ominous meaning if they faltered during a contested reign, suggesting the gods' displeasure and eroding confidence in the king's right to rule. The story of Egypt's shadow sons is one of ambition and uncertainty, of dynasties made and unmade by the children of women history often forgot. They were born behind locked doors, far from the public gaze, yet they shaped the fate of empires. Some rose from obscurity to rule as living gods, others vanished into exile or legend, their names deliberately erased. But all of them, legitimate or not, were products of the same hidden world, a world where power was born not just in temples or battlefields, but in the intimate, contested spaces of the royal harem. For every woman who rose from the harem to power and prestige, many more vanished into silence, erased from inscriptions, exiled to distant estates, or left to live out their days forgotten and nameless. Life behind the palace walls was a high-stakes game, and failure could mean far worse than obscurity. To fall from the king's favor was not simply a personal misfortune, it was a political death, a ritual erasure, and sometimes a literal one. The machinery of the state that once elevated a concubine could just as easily destroy her. A concubine's fall could be swift, triggered by something as simple as a shift in the pharaoh's attention. Royal favor was fickle, and beauty, the currency of influence, faded with time or competition. Younger women, foreign princesses, or politically valuable marriages could suddenly eclipse a once beloved companion. In such cases, the woman might quietly lose her privileges, her attendants reassigned, her jewelry reclaimed, her quarters moved farther from the king's chambers. The change was often subtle at first, but unmistakable, a slow, deliberate withdrawal of power and presence. Some women were dismissed for reasons more dangerous than disinterest. Accusations of disloyalty, sorcery, or political conspiracy could end a concubine's life overnight. The judicial papyrus of Turin records not just the execution of Ta and her co-conspirators during the harem conspiracy, but also the brutal punishments inflicted on lesser figures involved in the plot beatings, mutilations, forced suicides. Their names were chiseled from monuments, their families stripped of wealth, their descendants barred from office. The message was clear. Betrayal from within the harem was treason of the highest order, and it would be punished accordingly. Even lesser infractions could have devastating consequences. A concubine, accused of gossiping about the king, speaking to a foreign envoy without permission, or attempting to smuggle messages out of the harem, might be exiled to an isolated estate in the Delta, or deep into Nubia. There, stripped of titles and attendants, she would live under guard, often forbidden from ever returning to court. These exiles were not meant as merciful alternatives to execution. They were a slow form of erasure, a way to make a troublesome figure disappear without public spectacle. The most humiliating fate of all was damnatio memoriae, the deliberate destruction of memory. Inscriptions were defaced, statues broken, names scraped from temple walls. In Egyptian belief, to erase a person's name was to condemn them to a second death, denying them immortality in the afterlife. For many disgraced concubines, this was the ultimate punishment. Their existence wiped clean from history, their influence undone, as if it had never been. Archaeologists often encounter gaps in official king lists and harem records missing names, erased titles, blank cartouches, silent evidence of women who once held power but were deliberately forgotten. Occasionally, a disgraced concubine story intersected with broader political conflicts. Some were caught between competing factions, scapegoated to protect more powerful figures. Others were removed quietly as part of negotiations between the palace and priestly authorities. A woman whose son posed a threat to a favored heir might be accused of sacrilege and removed under the pretext of divine justice. Such cases reveal how accusations were often less about the alleged crime and more about neutralizing political risks. Even the charge of impurity, which could mean anything from ritual negligence to illicit correspondence, was enough to justify removal. Life in exile was rarely documented, but fragments of evidence hint at its bleakness. Ostraca, inscribed pottery shards, from remote estates speak of women identified only as former wives of the king, living under heavy supervision and relying on small stipends from the palace. Some were forced into temple service, spending their remaining years weaving linens or tending sacred gardens, work meant to humble and contain them. Others disappeared entirely, their fates sealed in silence beyond the reach of the scribes. Not all falls from grace were final. On rare occasions, a concubine could regain a measure of status if circumstances changed, if her son gained influence, if political winds shifted, or if the king himself sought reconciliation. In these cases, titles might be partially restored, and a woman's name could reappear on family stele or burial goods. Such restorations were exceptions, however, not the rule. For most, disgrace was a one-way descent, from which there was no return. The system's cruelty was intentional. Fear of disgrace maintained discipline within the harem, ensuring obedience even in the absence of direct supervision. The knowledge that a single misstep or a single whisper could end a life of privilege kept rivalries in check and ambitions carefully measured. It was a political mechanism as much as a personal one that bound the women of the harem to the throne as tightly through terror as through opportunity. In this world, memory was the final battlefield. A concubine's influence lived or died with the king's favor, and once that favor was gone, she could be unmade with the stroke of a chisel or the silence of a scribe. The harem, that had once been a stage for beauty, intrigue, and ambition, could in an instant become a place of ruin and erasure. For many, the story did not end in power or motherhood, but in oblivion, a reminder that in the shadow of the throne, the line between influence and annihilation was perilously thin. Even in death, the women of Egypt's royal harems remained part of the pharaoh's story. Their lives had been shaped by the rhythms of ritual, power, and obedience, and their deaths were no different, woven into the state's ideology and cosmic order. Burial was not merely a matter of disposing of the dead, it was a continuation of their role in sustaining the divine kingship. Every amulet, every inscription, every jar of oil placed in a tomb spoke of status, duty, and belief. Even in silence, these women still served the throne. The treatment a concubine received after death depended entirely on her rank and favor. The great royal wife was often interred in monumental tombs near her husband, sometimes within the Valley of the Kings or the Valley of the Queens. These burials rivaled those of pharaohs in their grandeur-decorated chambers, filled with texts from the Book of the Dead, richly painted scenes of the journey through the Duat, underworld, and offerings intended to sustain her for eternity. Concubines, by contrast, occupied a wide spectrum of burial practices, from lavish tombs to modest, unmarked graves. Their final resting places reflected the lives they had led, elevated, diminished, or erased. Favored concubines, particularly those who had borne royal children, were often honored with elaborate burials. Excavations in Thebes and Amarna have revealed richly furnished tombs containing finely crafted jewelry, alabaster vessels, cosmetic palettes, and figurines meant to serve the deceased in the afterlife. Inscriptions referred to them with exalted titles like Beloved of the King or Mother of the Divine Son, and some tomb paintings even depicted them standing beside the pharaoh in eternal union. These burials were not just personal honors. They were political statements affirming the continuity of the royal bloodline and the concubine's role in sustaining it. Other women received simpler but still dignified burials. They were laid to rest with basic grave goods, a shroud, a few vessels of food and drink, amulets for protection, and perhaps a small stela bearing their name and titles. Such tombs often reflected the middle ranks of the harem, women who had not borne heirs but had served loyally and without scandal. Their funerary texts emphasized service and devotion, portraying them as dutiful participants in the sacred order of kingship. Even in anonymity, their burials expressed their place within the vast machinery of the state. But not all concubines were given such honor. Those who had fallen from favor, been accused of treachery, or simply died in obscurity, could be denied proper burial rites, a punishment far worse than death itself in Egyptian belief. To be buried without offerings or funerary texts meant exclusion from the afterlife. To have one's name erased from tomb inscriptions was to be condemned to oblivion, severed from the cycle of rebirth. This was the final act of control the state could wield over a woman who had once shared the king's bed, to erase her even from eternity. The funerary rituals themselves were deeply symbolic and often echoed the roles these women had played in life. Priestesses invoked Hathor and Isis, calling upon them to guide the deceased into the afterlife. Perfumed oils were poured over the body in a final act of purification. Scarab amulets were placed over the heart to ensure rebirth, while small figurine shaptis were included to perform labor in the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise. These rituals reflected the belief that a woman's service did not end with death, but continued in the next world, where she might still nurture, protect, and sustain the pharaoh's eternal reign. The tombs of royal women also reveal how the Egyptians conceived of memory and immortality. Names were everything. To speak a name was to give it life. To carve it into stone was to anchor it forever. This is why disgraced concubines were stripped of their names, and why beloved ones were inscribed not just in their own tombs, but in those of their sons, husbands, and even grandsons. Inscriptions sometimes described a woman as she who renewed the blood of the two lands, or the one beloved of the living Horus, phrases that elevated her memory beyond the personal to the cosmic, binding her identity to the state's ongoing story. Some women continued to exert influence long after their deaths. Cults dedicated to royal mothers occasionally emerged, particularly if their sons became powerful or were associated with divine lineage. Offerings were made at their tombs, prayers recited in their names, and their images invoked in ceremonies. Even lesser concubines could become objects of local veneration if their offspring rose to prominence. Death, far from ending their role, could sometimes amplify it, transforming forgotten figures into revered ancestors. Archaeology has preserved only fragments of these stories. Many tombs were looted in antiquity, others were deliberately destroyed, yet even in their ruins they speak volumes. A single scarab inscribed with a woman's name, a shattered cosmetic jar, or a faded wall painting depicting a royal procession, each is a whisper from a life once bound to power and ceremony. Together, they reveal a society that saw no boundary between life and death, that extended its hierarchies and rituals into eternity. For the women of the harem, death was not a liberation from the world they had known. It was a continuation of it, a final act in the grand performance of kingship, memory, and cosmic order. Whether entombed in splendor beside the pharaoh or erased into silence, they remained part of the story of the throne. Even in the afterlife, their presence lingered unseen but essential, just as it had been in life. Behind the golden glory of ancient Egypt's greatest monuments lies a world that few ever saw, a world where power was forged in silence, where alliances were born in shadows, and where the fate of empires was shaped not only by kings and armies, but by the women hidden behind palace walls. Their lives were marked by ritual, ambition, and sacrifice, their bodies woven into the fabric of dynasties that still capture our imagination today. From sacred unions to deadly conspiracies, they reveal a side of history that is intimate, complex, and deeply human, the story beneath the stone. If this journey into Egypt's most secret chambers left you thinking differently about the ancient world, don't forget to subscribe for more untold histories, hidden rituals, and forgotten lives from the past. Like, share, and join us again, because the stories buried deepest are always the ones worth uncovering.